For 50 years, the official position of every major government space and defense agency in the world on the subject of UFOs was, with varying degrees of politeness, the same: nothing to see here. Misidentifications, weather phenomena, optical illusions, the overactive imaginations of otherwise credible people placed under stress in unusual environments, and anyone who pushed back on that position, any scientist who suggested the topic deserved serious study, any pilot who reported something that did not fit the available explanations, any official who asked too loudly for a more rigorous investigation, was made to feel the professional consequences of that pushback. Careers stalled, reputations suffered. The stigma was not accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and remarkably effective for half a century at keeping the subject outside the boundaries of legitimate scientific and governmental attention. And then, in a period of roughly 7 years, something changed. Not in one agency, not in one country. Across every major space agency, every branch of military aviation, the United States Congress, the Federal Aviation Administration, and institutions in multiple countries simultaneously, the position shifted. The question is why? And the answer, when you look at the specific sequence of events that produced it, is considerably more interesting than most of the coverage has suggested. To understand why the shift happened when it did, you need to understand why the stigma was so durable for so long. It was not simply that officials dismissed the evidence. It was that the institutional structure of how reports were handled made serious investigation almost impossible from the start. A military pilot who reported an unidentified object was under the culture that prevailed across most of the 20th century, implicitly reporting that he or she had failed to identify something that a competent professional should have been able to explain. The incentive ran in one direction: explain the sighting, dismiss it, move on. File a report, have it closed, never discuss it again. The people most likely to encounter genuinely unusual phenomena in airspace. Trained military aviators operating at the edge of technological capability in restricted airspace where conventional air traffic had been cleared, were the people with the strongest professional incentive to say nothing credible about what they saw. And that incentive was reinforced, according to multiple people who later testified before Congress, with explicit instructions. Ryan Graves, a former United States Navy F-18 pilot who became one of the most prominent voices pushing for change, said publicly that the informal message to pilots was clear: do not report this. It will not help your career. Keep it to yourself. The result was a system that generated almost no usable data, not because nothing was happening, but because the people seeing things had powerful reasons to stay quiet, and the people receiving reports had powerful reasons to close them quickly. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how institutional incentive structures shape behavior, and it produced exactly the outcome you would predict from such a structure. Decades of encounters, poorly documented, inconsistently investigated, and never aggregated into a database that would have allowed pattern analysis across multiple incidents. What broke the first crack in that structure was not a government initiative. It was a newspaper story. In December of 2017, the New York Times published a front-page investigation revealing that the United States Department of Defense had been secretly running a program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP, from 2007 to 2012, specifically to investigate military UAP encounters. The program had been funded at $22 million annually under a classified budget, initiated by Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, and had produced detailed reports on incidents, including the 2004 Nimitz encounter off the California coast, where Navy pilots tracked and filmed an object performing maneuvers that no known aircraft could replicate. The same day, the New York Times and Politico published the first officially released video footage from a military UAP encounter, the now famous Tic Tac video, a grainy infrared recording of an object moving in ways that violated every aerodynamic principle pilots had been trained to understand, captured by the sensors of a military aircraft during a training exercise that had been monitoring it for 2 weeks. The video was not leaked. It was released by the Department of Defense, which meant the government had made an active choice to put this footage in front of the public, with its own authentication attached. The institutional response to that decision was immediate and significant. For the first time, elected officials who had been briefed on UAP material in classified settings had public evidence they could reference. Senator Marco Rubio, who at the time was serving as vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, began pushing for a formal requirement that the intelligence community produce an unclassified public assessment of UAP. His argument was straightforward and bipartisan. If these objects are foreign technology, representing an adversary's capability to operate freely in restricted American military airspace, that is an intelligence failure of the first order. If they are not foreign technology, then something else is happening that is equally important to understand. Either way, the systematic suppression of reporting was the wrong policy, and Rubio had enough institutional credibility and enough classified briefings under his belt that his argument carried weight with colleagues who would otherwise have avoided the subject. In December of 2020, the legislation Rubio had been pushing became law. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 included a provision mandating that the Director of National Intelligence, in coordination with the Secretary of Defense, produce an unclassified report on UAP within 180 days. This was the first time in American legislative history that the government was legally required to publicly address the subject. The report that followed, released in June of 2021, covered 144 reports from government sources, mostly Navy aviation. Between 2004 and 2021, it acknowledged 18 incidents displaying what it described as unusual movement patterns or flight characteristics. It concluded that most reports probably do represent physical objects, and it explicitly stated that it could not explain the vast majority of cases in its database. Could not confirm, could not explain for a government document on this subject. That language was unprecedented. What followed was a cascade that each individual step made more inevitable. Congress required more reporting. Congress created new oversight mechanisms. Congress established the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, in 2022, with a mandate to collect, analyze, and resolve UAP reports from across all branches of the military and all federal agencies. And NASA, in June of the same year, announced something that would have been professionally unthinkable for most of its history. It was commissioning an independent scientific study team to examine UAP from a rigorous, data-driven perspective. The team of 16 scientists, former astronauts, and defense experts, chaired by astrophysicist David Spergel, president of the Simons Foundation, held public meetings, took testimony, reviewed available data, and on September 14, 2023, released their findings. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson accompanied the report with a statement that captured exactly how completely the institutional position had shifted. He said the agency wanted to shift the conversation about UAPs from sensationalism to science, and that the language of scientists is data. He also said something that had never appeared in an official NASA statement before in the agency's 65-year history. He said, "About UAPs, we do not know what these are." That statement mattered not just as a policy shift, but as a cultural one. NASA was the institution that put human beings on the moon, that launched the Hubble and the Webb, that built the credibility of American space science over more than 6 decades. When NASA said officially that it did not know what something was, that it considered the subject scientifically important, and that it had appointed a dedicated director to coordinate UAP research within the agency, it signaled something to every other institution watching. The stigma was not cost-free anymore. There was now institutional cover for taking the subject seriously, and the consequences began flowing from that. The Federal Aviation Administration updated its official procedures in 2020, replacing the term UFO with UAP across its official documentation and establishing mandatory reporting protocols for UAP observations by air traffic control personnel, linking UAP reporting directly to the AARO framework, and officially classifying UAPs as a potential national security concern. In Germany, the University of Würzburg established what it called the Interdisciplinary Research Center for Extraterrestrial Studies, developing an automated sky monitoring system it named All Sky CAM specifically to capture UAP data, in formal cooperation with Germany's National Civil Aviation Authority. In the United Kingdom, researchers and policy experts began producing formal white papers arguing that Parliament needed to develop explicit UAP policy, noting that UK military and intelligence services almost certainly have records of UAP encounters, and that the absence of any public acknowledgement placed the government's credibility at risk. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, one of the oldest and most respected professional organizations in aerospace engineering, established a formal UAP working group. The bipartisan Safe Airspace for Americans Act moved through multiple sessions of Congress with the explicit goal of protecting pilots who report UAP encounters from the career consequences that had suppressed reporting for decades. And then there was the data. As the stigma reduced and the reporting pathways opened, the volume of reports to AARO increased dramatically. As of October 2024, AARO held a total of 1,652 reports in its active database. Of the cases analyzed in the most recent consolidated annual report, AARO resolved 49 to prosaic explanations, balloons, drones, aircraft, satellites. It recommended closure for 243 more, pending peer review. It determined that 21 cases merit further analysis by intelligence community and science and technology partners, and 444 cases lacked sufficient data for analysis at all. The single most striking number in that database is not the resolved cases, it is the unresolved ones. Not the 444 with insufficient data, though those are significant. The 21 that have sufficient data and still cannot be explained by the best analytical resources the American intelligence and defense community can bring to bear. Those 21 cases sit in active investigation, and they have been there, formally documented, with full sensor data, with no conventional explanation, since before most of the public conversation about this subject ever reached its current level. The Disclosure Foundation, a nonprofit focused specifically on government transparency around UAP, noted in 2026 that Congress had mandated NASA to transfer its UAP records to the National Archives, and that as of early 2026, very little of that transfer had actually occurred. Their independent review team, led by former members of NASA's own UAP study team, said they had a high degree of confidence that significant records exist and have not yet entered the public domain, which is the part of this story that the shift in official attitudes does not yet resolve. The institutional position has changed. The stigma has been reduced, though not eliminated. The reporting pathways are open. The data is being collected. But the question of what is in the records that predated all of this, the decades of classified reports that accumulated before the 2017 moment that broke the institutional silence, is a question that the changed official attitude has not yet fully answered. The shift is real. The transparency it has produced is real. And the gap between the transparency that currently exists and the full picture of what governments accumulated across the preceding 50 years is also real and has not yet closed. The reason every major space agency suddenly started taking UFOs seriously is not mysterious. The evidence accumulated past a threshold where the cost of continued dismissal, in terms of national security, credibility, public trust, and scientific integrity, exceeded the cost of engagement. The pilots were too credible. The sensor data was too consistent. The congressional pressure was too sustained. And the stigma, which had been the primary enforcement mechanism of the previous consensus, lost its grip once institutions with enough prestige started treating the subject as legitimate. What that shift has produced is a world where the question is no longer whether these phenomena deserve investigation. It is a world where the investigation is ongoing, the data is accumulating, and the answer to what is actually being found is being worked out in real time by agencies that have now formally committed to answering it. Whether they will get there, and whether the public will be part of what they find when they do, remains the question that this entire shift has put at the center of a conversation that 50 years of institutional silence had done everything possible to prevent.